Hello and welcome to Conversations about Language Teaching. I am Dr. Reed Riggs, he, him.
And I'm Dr. Diane Neubauer, she, her.
Today's topic is the silent period, and it's going to be a very light approach to it. We have some thoughts. I guess this whole show is just our opinions anyways. We've pulled out a little bit of research to read from, but we're just going to share some thoughts. This might be a shorter episode.
Yeah, we'll
But
see.
it's important for language teachers to have on their radar, especially when working with novice, kind of beginning and novice level students.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And so the silent period is a term developed from, and I wasn't certain of this until I checked just now. It is attributed to Stephen Krashen. And so he referred to it, I believe I might have found where he referenced it for the first time in a publication from 1981, where he says on page 8, that children are usually allowed to go through a, quote, silent period, unquote, during which they build up acquired competence through active listening. Builds well off of our previous episode about comprehension as a goal of its own.
Sure.
So they're doing a lot of work here, but they're silent. So several scholars have suggested providing such a silent period for all performers in second language acquisition would be beneficial. See, for example, Postovsky, 1977. So this was a 1981 publication. And I think from there, that term and that concept of someone, particularly children, learning a new language or developing a new language ability, going through a period of time where they're not producing much spoken language. They're hearing a lot and they may be understanding an increasing measure of it, but their productive skills are behind or lagging behind, not in a negative way. This is saying this is natural. This is the way that humans develop ability with a new language. I've heard a story, and it might have been from hearing Dr. Krashen speak somewhere about African tribal groups where there were, and I'm not going to get exactly the right place, the kind of the Rift Valley kind of region of countries there. But they had different tribes who had beliefs where you needed to marry into a different tribe, but you didn't speak the same language. And so people who would marry in would stay silent for a period of even months, and then they would develop very native-like ability in that language. And so it's kind of one of those documented cases of adults doing the same kind of thing where they had that.
Yeah.
In ESL, in English as a second language, in the US context, the main state, like many states have adopted WIDA standards. It's WIDA out of Wisconsin, but it's not just for Wisconsin. So one of the things that they have promoted is an understanding of stages of second language acquisition. And they begin the first one, they call it pre-production or the silent period. And
Could
so
you repeat
again,
that first part?
looking at it,
I missed it. You said before silent period, you said what was the name of it? Pre-production?
pre-production.
Pre-production.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So PRE, like before the production. And then the second stage would be early production, then speech emergence, intermediate
Oh,
fluency, advanced
nice.
fluency.
That's great.
So this is attributing that based on Krashen and Terrell's 1983 book, The Natural Approach. But I've seen that silent period in the WIDA standards directly. So I'm looking at a variety of things about using WIDA standards.
Yeah. Well, to nuance a little bit, I have this little quote. I sent a screenshot to you from this Rod Ellis 2020 study, and I took it because I just wanted some kind of more like up to date capture of what's been talked about the silent period more recently, or at least in the decades since. So I'm just going to read this.
Place.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so Rod Ellis here. This is page 4, I think. He says, the initial stage in L2 acquisition is a receptive one. That is, learners listen, and if they're able to read, and if they're able to, read, process the input and start to build and store form function mappings. Okay. I'll put my own commentary in here is that when I read research for myself and when I tell other people about research, this is never meant to imply that the authority said so. So I don't want us to be listening to this and thinking, oh, a researcher said that. It all must be true. it's useful. That's what I bring it up because it's useful to think about, and it's less about truth and more about usefulness. This
Yeah.
is
And
his view.
evidence
This
for one or
evidence helps it more.
another.
Yeah.
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 Okay. So moving on. Just wanted to put that in there. Okay. So Ellis, he says here, during this period, learners may attempt to speak, but often, especially in the case of children, they go through a silent period. Research documenting the silent period is surveyed in Ellis 2008. A good example is Seville Troike's 1988 study of 9 children learning L2 English, second language English, in a kindergarten classroom. 5 of these opted for an extended silent period, while the other 4 spoke using single words or short phrases. Seville Troike suggested that the silent children were, quote, inner-directed learners, end quote, who viewed language learning as an intrapersonal task, while the early speakers were, quote, other-directed learners, end quote, who viewed learning as an interpersonal social activity. Even the other-directed learners, however, spent a lot of time listening to the speech around them, irrespective of whether learners elect to remain quiet, of trying speaking from the start. It is clear that what is paramount is the input they are exposed to.
Right.
So this also has me thinking about what's useful about this for teachers. How are you designing what you're going to be expecting students to do? Like, how are you going to be asking students to participate? Because, a lot of teachers are like, no, from the start, I want whole sentence responses. Like, I need to practice your
Yeah.
exact grammar, and we got to work on your pronunciation by getting your tongue and jaw moving so that your mouth can start to get the exercises to practice these sounds. I've seen this a lot.
Yeah.
And it
Start them on day
ignores
one,
day
talking.
one,
And
speak
like,
whole
there's a
sentences.
lot of
Yeah, yeah.
conference presentations that are titled something like that.
Get them talking early. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, so, but we also don't want to go in the opposite direction of saying, let me design my activities such that there's no space for anyone to talk. Like, so I'll force
Right.
them into a silent period. And I think the
Yeah.
value here is showing that the design of the tasks or activities are such that um, there's space for people to contribute when they want to. The readiness is allowed.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I would say, like, I found that that same study, the 1988 study, came up in my quick search on Google Scholar for silent period second language acquisition. And the second one was that one on private speech. And so when I've seen the silent period described, I have seen it like that, where either entire silence, but possibly short words, maybe phrases on occasion. But
so
it's
they
not,
define it. They define it as including the short little bits. Okay, interesting.
yeah.
So it's
So
not total silence. It's relative silence.
it could be total silence,
Yeah, yeah,
but and it's certainly, like you say, we're not saying we should have world language students in classrooms not talk
right,
ever. Like,
right.
no, we're not
Mhm.
saying we're stifling something that they
Sure.
want to do,
Yeah,
but we're seeing it as, there are stages that people go through. This is developmentally appropriate for them
yeah,
to have more
yeah.
listening, less speaking, at the early stages. What I find so interesting is that WIDA has recognized this, but in our ACTFL standards, I don't feel like we have a direct statement about a silent period or the possibility of a silent period. Although in talking about novice low students, in terms of the ACTFL proficiency descriptors, talking about novice low is that kind of word and phrase level, and
Sure.
maybe a few highly practiced, very familiarized kinds of
Yeah,
longer production. But
yeah,
but it's so at least there's some acknowledgement that, in proficiency development, in language acquisition,
yeah.
learners don't begin from full sentences that are native like.
Well,
That I think we can say.
there's two things. I think that when we're talking about proficiency, it's more about an observation, a description of what they can do, more so not based on what the teacher has directly helped them to do. So if you're talking about speaking proficiency, like, and it might be that a student is at the novice low level in speaking at a different time from when they're at a novice low level in listening. And so when we're talking about a silent period, it might be more helpful, like, because it seems like the actual descriptors are not saying that a learner is in all four skills a novice. It's saying that they're a novice in this one skill at this one time. And to say, if we had to rewrite them and include a silent period, it might not be relevant to have
true.
a silent period for the speaking criterion, for that speaking
Yeah. That
thing.
makes sense.
So if you say, if we were talking about a global, like an overall student proficiency level, and you say that, if the global proficiency is novice low, then speaking is going to be maybe non-existent, and we put that in writing. And then listening is going to be maybe picking out an individual word here or there. Heavy dependence on context, reliance on slow speech. But I think that it's those proficiency descriptors are a little bit more meant to be like four different rulers. Like we're measuring your speaking without the teacher's help, based on whatever experience you had. Now, your experience prior, if you're from a classroom, then yes, you had teacher's help. But it's just we're going to get out our speaking ruler and kind of measure where you're at right now, which is different and should not be interpreted as how teachers should teach.
That's the thing. The thing. And I think that's where the unfortunate part has been, where in WIDA, they will point out that this is part of the process. And I think as world language teachers, we can think about that more closely, so that when we're observing students who maybe not all of them, there's a whole lot of issues, I think, that come into play when we're
just to clarify,
ignoring this.
When you say part of the process, you mean part of the process of the student's own development, not part of the process of teaching.
Right.
Yep. It's important to separate these. So what do we do as teachers then? I always tell, so when I've had meetings with the teachers in my department now, as I'm the subject area lead for Japanese and Chinese, and when we look at standards and objectives that are coming from the IB, they'll often say like, oh, so I'm supposed to be doing this every day with my students. How often should I do this? And I say, no, this is a summative assessment that you'll do like at the end of the school year. How you teach is a completely separate topic. There should be some alignment. You should be getting them prepared to do that big summative thing at the end. But right now for this meeting, I am not talking about your instruction. That is not what this is about.
To get to that more extensive ability to produce, you don't practice doing the same exact thing again and again all year to be able to, you're developing language abilities that are going to be leading you to the outcome that is described there. That reminds me of a Justin Slocum Bailey blog post from 2016. I had reason to look this up recently, but it was about using can-do statements. I think it's maybe called use can-do statements, but not like this. And it was that sense of like, that descriptor at the outcome level is fine, but it doesn't mean that's how now I should make them practice doing that to teach it. No. No. That's how we go back and say, this is where you are now.
Sometimes I'll use them to, if here's like a classic, I can read a map or something, like I can give directions using a map. If I know that that's an end goal for maybe a unit, then I'll say, oh, cool, I have 2 months. Let's make up stories where we're using maps. Let's find some YouTube videos of people kind of talking through maps. And, I'll find all kinds of like supportive things to get us comfortable hearing people talk about maps. And when they have ideas about maps, we might draw some maps together. We'll make up some lizard people maps. I don't know. I had a map of Mars that I used. So those do help inspire me, those end objectives of what students can do. Like that helps inspire me to things we can do. But coming back to the silent period, I'm not calling on every single student to make sure that they say a full sentence about that thing. It's like I am a very much comprehension and communication, thinking, belief system kind of teacher. And so when I see, okay, students can talk about maps, then for me, the inspiration is great. Let me provide tons and tons of exposure to how we can talk about maps, or me talking about them and other people, classmates, when they're ready, talking about them. A lot of input comes from classmates as they're ready. At the end of the Ajan workshop, we did a lot of things.
Which is a language teaching conference in France.
Yeah, in France. Yep. And Diane typically was the Mandarin lab teacher, and you chose to take
I have
a
been
little
several
break.
times.
Yep. And so then
Yeah.
I kind of took your spot the last time. Thank you for that. And so I did a very like fully communication focused kind of thing. We talked about Chinese film industries in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and overseas, Hollywood. And each day kind of repeated the same topics over and over, but for like China the first day, and then Singapore one of the days, and we watched little film clips and act them out. But it was very communication focused, and I never called on my students to talk. But what did happen on the fifth day, on the final day, is they got kind of combative about my story ideas, and then they were relying on the posters with words that we developed over the week, but they
Yeah.
were interrupting me. I didn't say, "Hey, talk." I did not prompt them to talk. I was trying to narrate my cool idea that could happen next in the story. And so far they'd been giving thumbs up and thumbs down or single word responses. And I guess we can call that, silent period. But then they started jumping at me with their better ideas about what could happen in the story, looking and pointing at the poster, kind of having little pauses to search for a word that they want to say. And so they were reading words off the poster, which is burdensome
Yeah.
because there's a lot of words up there. Reading off a poster isn't just like, oh, now you have all this language you can fluently use. It's a burdensome process to find your own words on these complex word posters. But they had funnier ideas for our story we were
Mhm.
making up, and they were talking. And so from a language mental representation of language standpoint, I don't have much to say about it because I saw them using the posters. But as far
Mhm.
as a participation standpoint, I would say that that's like the next stage we want to see, is that they want to contribute and talk.
Yeah.
And if they have to rely on some resources to do that, that's fine. But it was, topic coherent. It was pretty full sentences because they had these
Yeah.
complex meanings they wanted to express. Like, no, he
Oh,
wasn't there. He had the giant mango that his friend wanted to eat. It was his friends wants to eat the giant mango, but he had the giant mango. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah. Okay, cool. It's a great idea for a story. Um,
yeah.
so that I think is also like kind of a neat example of like, building a story or a scene together is a neat way of having some space for students to say more when they're ready and want to say more.
Right. There's
You've
an appeal to their involvement and their, yeah,
It
what
was
they would
always their
say
involvement. It
is
was always asking.
consequential.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was always asking for their ideas and opinions. And because they weren't ready linguistically to say more, they just gave one word answers. But then
Hmm.
when they're like, hey, I'm feeling a little brave right now.
Hmm.
I got my words up there. I know where my main words
Yeah.
are, and I
And
have this fun idea. Yeah.
I would argue they've got at least the receptive, like they know, oh, I know I've got that word up there somewhere. So even if they
Right.
need to use those posters,
Yeah.
I'd still they're in progress with those words being acquired, just to be able to find,
Yeah.
like, I know it's up there. They're not
Yeah.
just randomly looking at posters to try to find any old word.
Oh, right.
They're
No,
thinking, I know I've got
they're
it
like,
up
oh, I know
there.
that's up there. Oh, no,
Yeah.
I
So
know
I
we
would
use that. I know
say,
we use that. Yeah.
they're not ready. Yeah, they're not ready to produce it without looking yet, but that doesn't
Sure.
mean that they're not somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, if it were,
Um,
oh, go ahead.
well, this would turn to another little topic of one of the things I found when I was doing a search for the silent period online.
I go for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Mhm.
so this is the ESL Nexus. This is a article online, I'll call it, but it's all about the silent period, and it brings up something that, yeah, they call it a blog post. Why this is important for teachers to know, and one of their first headings is there something wrong? And
Mm.
they're arguing in this, and I would argue it's legitimate. No, you don't have to be alarmed that because someone is quieter or more limited in their productive skill at that early stage, that is not something to be worried about. And I think we can tell parents, administrators, fellow teachers, our students, and ourselves, and like make sure all the stakeholders around the language classroom know that this is not atypical. This is not uncommon, and this is not problematic, but that this is a thing that's observed in research. And when I was doing the little research search on Google Scholar for the silent period, there are still very contemporary studies that are referring to this. So from
Mm.
the 1980s through looks like quite present day. And you had
Yeah.
Brad Ellis as a 2020 example
It
there.
was,
So,
yeah, the title of that article I mentioned real quick is called Task-Based Language Teaching for Beginning Level Young Learners.
mhm,
I think typically in the research, it's been mainly about children, and we should say something about um, if it's always looking at children, then we haven't really decoupled age as a factor. Um, but in my experience, it's similar. In my personal
yeah.
experience, it's similar with I taught college for about 5 years, 6 years, teaching high school now, and then I've worked with adults in France. And I don't see it as
Mhm.
different. I personally don't see it as different. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is great in this blog post that it says like, well, if not expecting to have early learners produce a lot of language, then well, how can they be involved in class? And I
Ah,
think that issue is important. So give them
mhm.
other options.
Yeah.
Have them act, do things, draw. Instead of
Hmm.
talking about them, use lots of visuals and realia to explain their meaning,
Hmm.
work with a partner where they can express meaning more quietly and privately rather than, a whole classroom listening to them all at once and judging their language production or
Yeah. Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
So speaking particularly of multilingual learners in English language classrooms in the
Oh, right.
US.
Yeah.
But
So
I
you've
think
got
the same thing,
some kind of content you need to teach. And so if
right?
you're a math class and you've got some students that are in those early stages, um,
Yeah,
maybe don't call them so directly for
right.
answers.
But
Or
give them other
when you
ways
do
to
call on
show
them,
their
yeah, yeah.
comprehension.
When you do call
Hmm.
on them, let them like point to something or read off of something. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in that case, you've got the new learner in there in a classroom with many other different proficiency levels of English speakers.
Yeah.
But in a world language classroom, you might end up with much more of a consistent, everybody's a beginner here.
In the US.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
provide all of them with that kind of
Sure.
opportunity. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't think that there's ever a a real strong need. Maybe there's a case here or there that I could be convinced, but like, why do we need to make a beginner speak out loud in a full sentence as though that were determining the progress in the language
If you
for them?
believe
Like if they don't
that,
do that, or
I
what
know.
are they going to miss? I
I know.
don't think they're going to miss anything.
I've heard this muscle metaphor at times, and I think it's not a good metaphor for how the brain
Right.
works.
That's
The brain doesn't
behavioralism.
work like a muscle, but I've heard people say like, well, with a muscle, you gotta, lift a weight over and over. It makes your muscle stronger. And so by producing it over and over, you get stronger at producing it. And I just think it's
Mm,
just not an appropriate metaphor. It's
right. Right.
the mind does other things. It's a kind of software system. There's the computer metaphors that people often use. And if you don't want a computer metaphor, there's statistical metaphors, and there's other ways you can describe the brain.
Mhm.
None of them resemble the simplicity of a muscle getting stronger.
Right.
It's always more complex than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, silent period. I watched my daughter go through
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
one word stage and then two word stage. And I think back on fun phrases that we would repeat a lot. My wife and I would repeat a lot. For a long time, we'd get our controllers to play video games together, and she'd go, Joel, Joel. And then the menorah for Hanukkah, and she'd go, new, new. And I started to
Hmm.
think there's kind of a pattern. I was like, oh, it's the stressed syllable.
Interesting.
That's what she's saying. She's just saying the stressed syllable. And and then there was the two-word phrase would be like in Vietnamese, "Mommy hat." Hat is to sing. And so at night we try
Mm.
to walk away, and she go, Daddy hat, Mommy
Oh,
hat, Mommy hat. And it's like, okay, okay, we'll sing a couple more songs.
yeah.
So she could combine these two little words together, and that was sort of the start of her syntax and production. And now she
And
says
delaying her
long things.
bedtime.
Absolutely. There's a social purpose to all of these. Yes, for
Yes.
sure. It's
Yep.
often she wants the thing. Yeah, her newest thing is what this is. What this is. And I'm like,
Oh,
"Oh," and
fun.
it's often a song that she might want to hear again. If she doesn't like the song, she goes, "No, no, no," when we're in the car. No, no, no. And then if she likes it, she'll go, "What this is." Sometimes she says, "What is this?"
Oh, she wants to get
And
an
then
identifier so
so
she
that
can
she
ask
can
for it maybe
request it
later.
again. Yep. A lot of it's about making
Yeah.
later requests, I think. So
Yeah, interesting.
but the interesting thing is that I don't think any caregivers of children put those milestones on a calendar in advance. that they never say, all right, we really got to get to that one word stage by November 15th. Okay, we're going to have to assess the 2-word stage. So we got to put it on the calendar for January 12th. Gotta get them to that 2-word stage. I've never heard of it. There's just a basic recognition that child language development is only predictable in terms of the general stages, and otherwise not predictable at all. Not the specific words they'll learn, not the specific syntactic patterns they show and how they put sentences together, and definitely not the exact calendar dates. And as teachers, we have this institutional pressure to do that. And one of the ways to get away from that is to define your goals in terms of communication and not language. So those can-do statements are fine. And even then, you're not saying they can, you're not putting in the can-do statement that it'll be a full sentence.
Right. It's like achieving a communication goal.
Yeah, I can make a list of groceries. I can share about a vacation. I can narrate a story, something that's defined generally as the meaning you'll be communicating about, and not, in a sentence that's 5 words or longer. It's like you're pushing them past their development if you do that. Yeah. And your students will all be different. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking another little mention of automatic language growth, which would say, yeah, we think so much about the silent period that we want to allow adult learners to have that same thing. And kind of going back to that Krashen quote, like that, what if all second language learners had that opportunity where they were not given the hard push immediately to produce speech? What would their outcomes be? Could it be, according to ALG, they see some really native-like productive abilities by allowing quite a long, gradual silent period in their classroom teaching, where it's very much about comprehension, even at a very fuzzy level, but growing in comprehension and then eventually production. So it's interesting.
It's interesting. I'd like to know more about it. We
at least respect the learner and the learner's internal process as they're going.
Yeah. Yep. I think there are many paths to development, language proficiency. Right. And then there's just other institutional pressures we have in school that we have to sometimes redefine for ourselves. If you're a teacher who's been using a textbook for a long time and you accept the sequence of instruction and learning that the textbook presents to you, if that shapes your belief system about what learners are supposed to do by a certain time, it might be hard to think otherwise in terms of more just general open-ended usage of language. Yeah.
It was a reason why when I was a consultant on a Chinese language textbook that had can-do statements at the beginning of each, was it unit or chapter, maybe both. But that was Go Far with Chinese by Chung and Sui. But I was one to keep reminding them that we need to have a comprehension goal in this list, and we need to have an intercultural goal in this list every time, because they had a tendency in the first draft to have a list of production goals, and at least to get, at least 1 or 2 comprehension goals and at least 1 intercultural.
That's really good.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's I don't have anything else to say about the silent period. I think we said everything that we could say.
I will put the links into the thing. Oh, and we should mention before we close, we are still taking questions for a question and answer episode 21, which will be the next episode after this one. So if you write in quick,
20.
This is episode 20. Yeah, we're aiming for 21 to be some Q&A.
Very fun.
Oh, and so to do that, write to us by email at conversationsaboutlanguage@gmail.com.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for listening. Thank you, Diane.
Yeah. Talk to you later.
Talk to you later.